Picture someone 6 months into their healing journey. They thought they'd feel lighter by now, freer, more at peace. Instead, they feel heavier than they did before they started. They're more aware of their patterns, more sensitive to the ways they betray themselves, more tired from doing the inner work that nobody around them can see. And somewhere in the back of their mind, a voice keeps asking the same question. Am I doing this wrong? Jung would have recognized that question immediately. He spent years sitting across from people who were genuinely transforming, genuinely doing the hard psychological work, and yet felt worse than when they'd started. What fascinated him was that almost every single one of them believed they were failing. They compared their inner experience to some image of healing they'd absorbed, calm, radiant, unburdened, and concluded that whatever was happening to them must be something else entirely. Jung saw the opposite. He saw people in the thick of the realest healing they'd ever done, and he noticed something that still challenges everything popular psychology tells us about getting better. The people who were healing the most looked the least like the culture's picture of a healed person. They were messier, more confused, more uncomfortable in their own skin, temporarily, because something underneath was shifting in a way that wouldn't announce itself for months, sometimes years. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung actually observed about the healing process, what it looks like when it's real, why it feels so different from what you've been told to expect, and why the stage you might be in right now, the one that feels like failure, could be the most important psychological work you've ever done. There's a reason most people quit their healing journey partway through, and it has almost nothing to do with a lack of willpower or commitment. It has to do with expectation. Somewhere along the way, we absorbed a narrative about what healing is supposed to feel like, and that narrative is, for the most part, a lie. The narrative goes something like this. You identify what's wrong, you work through it, you release it, and you emerge on the other side as a calmer, more peaceful, more whole version of yourself. It's linear, it's progressive. Each day is supposed to be a little better than the last, and if you're doing it right, you should be able to feel the weight lifting in real time. Jung would have had serious problems with that story. His entire body of work points to something much more uncomfortable, that real psychological healing is cyclical, disorienting, and frequently feels like regression before it feels like progress. He described individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, as one of the most demanding things a human being can undertake. He never described it as peaceful, he described it as necessary. And that distinction matters more than you might think. Because when you expect peace and get chaos, you assume you're broken. When you expect linear progress and find yourself revisiting the same wound for the third time, you assume you're stuck. When you expect to feel lighter and instead feel everything more intensely than before, you assume the work isn't working. Jung saw hundreds of patients cycle through this exact crisis of confidence, and what he kept discovering was that the crisis itself was part of the healing. The confusion, the disorientation, the feeling of going backward. These were signs that the psyche was reorganizing at a level too deep for the conscious mind to track. Think about someone who grew up learning to suppress anger. For decades, they were the calm one, the reasonable one, the person who never raised their voice. They start doing inner work, maybe therapy, maybe shadow work, maybe just honest self-reflection for the first time in their life. And within a few months, they're angrier than they've ever been. They're snapping at people. They're crying in their car. They're having thoughts they find disturbing. To the outside world, this person looks like they're falling apart. To Jung, this person's psyche is finally doing what it needed to do 40 years ago. The anger that was frozen is thawing. The grief that was sealed away is leaking through. The parts of themselves they exiled in childhood are showing up and demanding to be felt. That's what the early stages of real healing look like. They look like falling apart, and almost nobody tells you this going in. Jung developed a concept he called the shadow, the collection of everything about yourself that you've decided is unacceptable. Every trait you were punished for showing, every emotion you were told was too much, every impulse you buried because expressing it would have cost you love, safety, or belonging. The shadow doesn't disappear when you suppress it, it just goes underground, and it runs your life from there, shaping your choices, your relationships, your reactions in ways you can't see because you've trained yourself to look away from it. When someone begins genuine healing work, one of the first things that happens is the shadow starts surfacing. Jung documented this extensively. Patients would come in reporting vivid dreams, sudden emotional outbursts, old memories rising up uninvited, irrational fears they thought they'd dealt with years ago. They'd describe feeling like a stranger to themselves, like the ground beneath their identity was shifting. Jung recognized this as the psyche opening a door that had been locked for a long time. And the thing about opening that door is that you don't get to choose what comes through first. The psyche has its own sequence, its own timing. You might start this journey wanting to address your anxiety, and instead find yourself face to face with a grief you didn't even know you were carrying. You might sit down to journal about a recent relationship and end up writing about something your mother said when you were 7. This is the part that makes people feel like they're doing it wrong, because it doesn't feel controlled. It doesn't feel like the tidy step-by-step process they read about. It feels chaotic. And for someone who's spent their whole life managing chaos by keeping everything contained, that feeling is terrifying. But here's what Jung kept observing in the patients who stayed with the process. The chaos had a direction. It looked random on the surface, but underneath, the psyche was doing something remarkably intelligent. It was surfacing material in the order it needed to be processed. The seemingly unrelated memories, the strange dreams, the sudden emotional floods. They were connected by threads the conscious mind couldn't see yet. Jung compared this to the way a fever works. A fever looks like the body failing. Temperature rises, the person feels terrible, everything seems to be getting worse. But the fever is the immune system doing its job. The heat is the body fighting the infection. Suppressing the fever might make you feel better in the short term, but it interferes with the actual healing. Psychological healing works the same way. The discomfort, the confusion, the feeling of things getting worse, that's the psyche's fever. That's the system doing what it needs to do. And when you suppress it, when you medicate it away without understanding it, when you distract yourself or decide the process is too much and shut it down, you stop the healing at the exact point where it was finally working. One of the most painful parts of genuine healing is what it does to your relationships. And this is another thing nobody prepares you for. When you start seeing your own patterns clearly, you start seeing everyone else's patterns too. You can't unsee them. The friend who only calls when they need something, you used to call that closeness. Now you see the dynamic for what it is. The family member whose approval you've been chasing for decades, you used to think that if you just tried harder, things would change. Now you understand that the relationship was never built to hold honesty. Jung wrote extensively about how individuation creates distance between the person transforming and the people around them. He didn't frame this as a side effect. He framed it as an inherent part of the process. Becoming psychologically whole means becoming honest about what you've been tolerating, and that honesty has consequences. You might find yourself pulling away from people you've known for years, feeling guilty about it, wondering if something is wrong with you. You might notice that conversations that used to feel normal now feel draining, that dynamics you participated in willingly now make your chest tight. You might lose people, and the loss will ache in a way that makes you question whether this whole journey was worth it. Jung would have told you that the ache is real, and it deserves to be felt. He also would have told you that what you're grieving isn't always the person. Sometimes you're grieving the version of yourself who could tolerate that dynamic. That version is dying. And their death, while necessary, is still a death. It still needs to be mourned. This is where the soil metaphor becomes honest. Real healing is more like composting than like cleaning. You're taking the dead material of your old patterns, your old identity, your old ways of relating, and you're letting them break down. It smells. It's ugly. It takes much longer than you want. But something is forming in that darkness that couldn't form any other way. Richness, depth, the kind of ground that can actually sustain new growth instead of the thin, exhausted topsoil you've been trying to plant in for years. Jung saw this in patient after patient. The ones who let the old structures decompose, the false self, the people-pleasing persona, the identity built on being needed, those were the ones who eventually built something real. The ones who tried to skip the decomposition, who wanted to jump straight from awareness to transformation, kept building on the same unstable ground and wondering why everything they built kept collapsing. There's a stage of healing that Jung found particularly fascinating, and it's one that most modern approaches to psychology barely acknowledge. It's the stage where you understand everything about your pattern and still can't stop doing it. You've done the reading, you've made the connections. You can name your attachment style, identify your triggers, trace your behaviors back to their origins. You understand exactly why you chase unavailable people, or why you overfunction in relationships, or why you go quiet when you're hurt instead of speaking up. You see all of it with perfect clarity, and you keep doing it anyway. This stage destroys people, because understanding is supposed to be the hard part, right? Once you see the pattern, you're supposed to be able to change it. That's what every self-help book implies. Awareness leads to change. Except Jung observed something far more humbling. Awareness is necessary for change, but awareness alone isn't sufficient. There's a gap between seeing the pattern and being free of it, and that gap can last months or years. What happens in that gap is some of the most important psychological work a person can do. Because in that gap, you're forced to develop something that insight alone can't give you. Compassion for the parts of yourself that aren't ready to change yet. Jung would have called this shadow integration, the process of making peace with the parts of yourself that you'd rather transcend, the part that still craves approval, the part that still flinches when someone raises their voice, the part that knows the relationship is toxic and stays anyway because the familiarity feels safer than the unknown. These parts aren't defective, they're adaptive. They formed in response to real threats, and they won't dissolve just because your conscious mind has decided they're no longer useful. Real healing means sitting with those parts instead of warring against them. It means acknowledging that the child who learned to fawn wasn't weak, they were brilliant. They read the room and figured out the only strategy that would keep them safe. The fact that the strategy has outlived its usefulness doesn't erase the intelligence behind it. This is something I want to sit with for a moment, because it ties directly into the work of understanding yourself at a deeper level. If any of this is landing for you, if you recognize yourself in these patterns, our guide True Self-Discovery offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, the kind of inner work that meets you in that gap between seeing the pattern and learning to hold it with honesty. You'll find the link below. And this brings us to one of Jung's most radical observations about what healing actually produces. Because the destination looks nothing like what most people imagine. If you ask most people what a healed person looks like, they'll describe someone who's moved past their pain, someone who's let go of anger, someone peaceful, centered, maybe a little wise in that quiet way, someone who's processed their trauma and come out clean on the other side. Jung describes something very different. He describes someone who's learned to carry their full experience without being crushed by it. The pain doesn't disappear. The wounds don't vanish. The memories don't lose their weight. What changes is the person's relationship to all of it. He used the word wholeness deliberately, and he distinguished it sharply from the word perfection. A whole person in Jung's framework isn't someone who's eliminated their darkness. It's someone who's made room for it. Someone who knows their shadow and has stopped pretending it doesn't exist. Someone who can feel anger without becoming anger. Someone who can hold grief without drowning in it. Someone who can acknowledge their capacity for selfishness, pettiness, jealousy, all the human ugliness, without needing to exile those parts to maintain their self-image. This is a radically different vision of healing than what popular culture sells. Popular culture sells transcendence. Jung offered integration. And integration is harder, messier, and far more sustainable. Think about what this means practically. A person who's done genuine integration work doesn't react less. They react differently. When someone crosses a boundary, they feel the anger. They don't suppress it or spiritualize it or tell themselves they should be above it. They feel it. They understand where it's coming from, and they choose their response from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. The emotion is still there. The difference is that it moves through them instead of controlling them. Jung saw this in his most transformed patients. They weren't calm in the way people expect, serene, detached, floating above it all. They were grounded, present, capable of enormous feeling without being destabilized by it. They could sit with someone else's pain without absorbing it. They could hold space for complexity without needing to reduce it to something simple. And they were often quieter than they'd been before. Quieter in a way that unsettled the people around them, because the old version of them had been loud with performance, performing wellness, performing strength, performing the role everyone expected. The integrated version didn't need to perform anything, and that absence of performance looked to the outside world like withdrawal. There's another dimension of real healing that Jung addressed directly, and it's one that tends to catch people off guard. The relationship with solitude changes completely. Before healing, for many people, being alone is something to be endured. It's where the thoughts get loud, where the emptiness becomes unbearable, where all the things you've been distracting yourself from come flooding in. You keep busy, you stay connected, you fill every silence because silence is where the pain lives. During healing, solitude becomes necessary. You start craving it in a way that surprises you. The noise of other people's energy, their expectations, their unspoken needs, it becomes overwhelming in a way it wasn't before, because you're no longer numb to it. Your sensitivity isn't increasing, you're just no longer suppressing what was always there. And the only place you can hear your own thoughts clearly, the only space where your psyche can do its reorganizing work, is in quiet. Jung valued solitude enormously. He built a tower at Bollingen, a stone structure with no electricity, no phone, deliberately stripped of modern convenience, because he understood that the deepest psychological work requires an environment that doesn't pull your attention outward. He didn't see this as escape. He saw it as the necessary condition for meeting yourself. And this is where people in the healing process start to worry again. Because wanting to be alone, in a culture that equates connection with health and isolation with pathology, feels like a symptom. Your friends worry about you. Your family thinks you're depressed. You wonder if maybe they're right. Jung would have pushed back here. He drew a clear distinction between isolation that comes from avoidance and solitude that comes from necessity. Isolation is running from something. Solitude is turning towards something. Isolation is empty. Solitude is full. And you can usually tell the difference by how it feels when you're in it. If you're alone and restless, agitated, crawling out of your skin, that might be avoidance. If you're alone and something inside you is settling, deepening, becoming still in a way that feels like relief, that's solitude doing its work. The people around you might not be able to tell the difference from the outside. That's okay. You don't owe them a diagnosis of your inner life. You do owe yourself the honesty to know which one it is. Jung identified something else about healing that deserves attention: the way it rewires your relationship with control. Most people who end up doing deep psychological work were controllers. Maybe not in the obvious domineering sense, more often in the subtle sense, managing other people's emotions to keep the environment safe, anticipating problems before they happened, staying 3 steps ahead so nothing could catch them off guard. This kind of control often gets mislabeled as responsibility or maturity. Jung saw it as a trauma response that had become an identity. Healing means gradually loosening that grip, and loosening control is one of the most terrifying things a person can do, because the control was never really about control. It was about safety. If I manage everything, nothing can hurt me. If I anticipate every possibility, I'll never be blindsided. If I stay vigilant, I'll never be caught vulnerable. The problem is that this kind of hypervigilance is exhausting, and it blocks the very experiences that healing requires. You can't integrate your shadow while maintaining tight control of your self-image. You can't let grief move through you while clenching your jaw against it. You can't form genuine intimacy while monitoring every interaction for potential threat. Jung observed that his patients who made the deepest progress were the ones who developed what he might have called a tolerance for not knowing. They stopped needing to understand everything before they could accept it. They stopped requiring guarantees before they could take emotional risks. They learned to sit in ambiguity, that uncomfortable space where you don't know if you're healing or falling apart, where you can't tell if the relationship is transforming or ending, where you have no idea who you're becoming, and you let yourself not know. That tolerance for uncertainty is, in Jung's framework, one of the truest markers of psychological maturity, and it doesn't come from insight or understanding. It comes from repeated experience of surviving the uncertainty. Every time you sit in the not knowing and discover that you're still okay on the other side, the grip loosens a little more. The nervous system learns, slowly, that safety doesn't require control, that you can be open and still be whole. This is the part that I think matters most, and it's the piece that Jung returned to again and again throughout his career. True healing changes what you want. Before the work, you want to feel better. You want the pain to stop. You want to be the version of yourself that doesn't get triggered, doesn't attract the wrong people, doesn't carry the weight of everything they've ever been through. You want healing to subtract, to remove the damage, strip away the dysfunction, leave you clean and light. After the work, something shifts in what you're actually reaching for. You stop wanting to feel better and start wanting to feel honestly. You stop chasing the absence of pain and start building a life that can hold the full range of what you're capable of feeling. You stop trying to become someone without wounds and start becoming someone whose wounds have made them capable of a depth that people without those wounds will never access. Jung called this the treasure in the darkness. He believed that the wound and the gift were located in the same place. That the thing you most want to flee from is also the thing that holds your greatest capacity. The person who survived emotional neglect and developed the ability to read a room at a molecular level, that ability is both the wound and the power. The person who lived through chaos and developed an extraordinary tolerance for sitting with other people's pain, that tolerance is both the scar and the offering. Healing, in this framework, doesn't mean getting rid of what happened to you. It means learning to hold it in a way that serves your life instead of running it. It means becoming someone who can use the depth they were forced to develop, consciously and by choice, rather than being used by it. And this is slower than anyone wants it to be. Jung never suggested otherwise. He described individuation as the work of a lifetime, and he meant it literally. There's no end point where you arrive and are done. There's no final integration after which everything is settled. The psyche keeps producing new material, new challenges, new invitations to go deeper. What changes isn't the arrival of some permanent state of wellness. What changes is your willingness to keep going. Something Jung observed in his later years is worth sitting with here. He noticed that his patients who had done the most integration work shared a quality he found difficult to name. They were softer and stronger at the same time. They had fewer opinions but deeper convictions. They spoke less but said more. They could be alone without loneliness and together without losing themselves. They had also stopped explaining themselves. This was one of the most consistent markers. The compulsion to be understood, to make sure everyone knew their motives, their reasons, their internal experience, had quieted. They said what they meant. They did what they felt was right, and they let the interpretation fall where it would. This isn't detachment in the cold sense. It's more like a deep trust in their own experience that no longer requires external validation to feel real. Jung saw this as one of the final movements of individuation, the moment when the locus of authority shifts from outside to inside. When you stop looking to others to confirm that your experience is valid and start trusting the evidence of your own inner life. For people earlier in the process, this can sound aspirational to the point of being discouraging. If you're in the stage where you still desperately need someone to understand what you're going through, hearing about people who've transcended that need can feel like another way you're falling short. So let me be direct about this. Wherever you are is where the work is happening. If you're in the messy stage, that's the work. If you're in the stage where you understand the pattern and keep repeating it, that's the work. If you're in the stage where you can't stop crying and don't even know why, that's the work. If you're in the stage where everything feels numb and distant and you're wondering if you've lost the ability to feel, that's the work too. Jung would have told you that the psyche knows what it's doing even when you don't. That the process has its own intelligence, its own timing, its own sequence. Your job is to stay present with what's emerging, to resist the urge to rush it or fix it or compare it to someone else's timeline, and to keep showing up for yourself in the quiet, unglamorous, repetitive way that real transformation requires. There's one more thing I want to name, because it's the thing that makes all of this survivable, and it's something Jung himself embodied throughout his life. Even during his most difficult periods: curiosity. the willingness to look at what's emerging with genuine interest rather than just fear. To ask, what is this trying to show me, instead of, how do I make this stop? To approach your own psyche the way you'd approach a landscape you've never seen before, with attention, with patience, with the understanding that you don't have to map the whole territory today. Jung maintained this posture of curiosity through years of his own intense inner work. During what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of profound psychological upheaval that lasted years, he didn't just endure it, he engaged with it. He painted, he wrote, he recorded his dreams and dialogued with the figures that appeared in them. He treated his own unconscious as something worth listening to, even when what it was telling him was frightening. And that's what true healing looks like in the end. It looks like someone who's willing to stay in conversation with themselves, even when the conversation is hard. Someone who doesn't run from what's surfacing, doesn't pathologize it, doesn't try to spiritual bypass their way over it. Someone who sits down in the dirt of their own experience, the real dirt, the composted remains of who they used to be, and stays long enough to see what grows. It won't look like the pictures. It won't match the timelines. It won't earn applause from people who've never done the work, but it will be real. And in a world full of performed healing, performed growth, performed transformation, real is the rarest thing there is. Jung spent his entire career pointing to this single truth. The goal of psychological life isn't to be perfect or even to be happy. The goal is to be whole. And wholeness includes the broken parts, the dark parts, the parts you wish weren't there. It includes everything you've survived and everything it cost you and everything it gave you that you didn't ask for. You're allowed to be in process. You're allowed to be mid-transformation with no clear picture of where you're headed. You're allowed to look nothing like the image of healing you were sold and still be healing, maybe more deeply than you realize. The ground beneath your life is shifting. That's supposed to happen. Something is taking root in the dark, in the quiet, in the space between who you were and who you're becoming. You can't see it yet, but Jung would tell you it's there, and he'd tell you to trust it, the way you trust the season that comes after winter, even when the snow shows no sign of stopping. If this resonated with you, if you're somewhere in the middle of this process and you're ready to go deeper into the work Jung described, our guide, True Self-Discovery, walks you through 24 reflection exercises designed to meet you exactly where you are. Rooted in Jung's teachings, built for the kind of honest inner work we've been talking about. You'll find the link below.